Good evening, everyone. I'm Robin Friedman, one of the co-founders of Tribe Talk, and along with my fellow co-founders, Jude Sidney and Michelle Black, I'd like to welcome you here tonight for this important discussion. We're very grateful to have scholar warrior Dr. Rachel Fish with us tonight to lead us through this conversation, as well as three high school seniors, Carly LeKind, Ariel Mogilesco, and Haley Oberlander, all peer leadership fellows of the Jewish Teen Initiative of Combined Jewish Philanthropies, which we call JTI. They'll be sharing some experiences with anti-Semitism and possibly leading a breakout room for high school students tonight. We're going to start the program by hearing from our peer leadership fellows about their experiences with anti-Semitism. Then Dr. Fish will help us understand rising anti-Semitism and recent events. And afterwards, there'll be time for a Q&A. We'll be monitoring the chat, so if a question comes to mind, feel free to put it in. Also, there'll be time for a live Q&A as well. I'm now turning it over to Haley.
For those of you who are new to our host, Tribe Talk, their mission is to empower students to have a meaningful Jewish life on the college campus, to help high school and college students feel proud of their heritage and identity, and to help them meet and address obstacles they may face, in particular those arising from anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. This program is co-sponsored by the Jewish Teen Initiative of Combined Jewish Philanthropies, also known as JTI. JTI connects, empowers, inspires, and mobilizes teens and the professionals who help support them throughout the greater Boston area. It helps teens navigate their Jewish journey and inspires them to be the change they wish to see. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jude.
Thank you. For those of you who have not had the privilege of hearing from Dr. Fish before, she is the co-founder of Boundless, a new nonprofit think action tank reimagining Israel education and engagement and taking bold collective action to combat Jew hatred across North America. Dr. Fish is a celebrated academic with 20 years of experience in the fields of Israeli history, Zionist thought, and Middle Eastern studies. Recognized for her teaching prowess and pedagogical approaches, Dr. Fish has published extensively and is frequently called upon to advise on community interventions to reclaim an Israel discourse that is nuanced and complex while remaining accessible to a broad audience. Previously, Dr. Fish was the founding executive director of the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism. Dr. Fish completed her doctoral degree in the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies Department at Brandeis University. In 2015, Dr. Fish held a Rohr Visiting Professorship at Harvard University, and her bio goes on. We are delighted to have Dr. Fish, but my pleasure to introduce now Carly, one of our JTI peer leadership fellows, who will tell us about an anti-Semitism experience. Carly?
Hi, everyone. I'm Carly LeKind, and this is just one of many anti-Semitism experiences that I myself have been through. So during a school emergency called a hold passing, due to another student who was having a medical emergency, everyone was called to the auditorium so that we could clear the hallways. And while sitting in there, multiple people got airdropped pictures of swastikas on their phone. I personally did not, but one of my other friends who is Jewish did, and we were all very unsure on what to do. So thankfully, one of my brave friends reported it to our dean of students, and luckily they handled it the right way, and they called an assembly the next morning to address it right away. And this is just one of many incidents that a lot of us have experienced. And I would like to share this because it's really difficult to know when to call it out, and I'm hoping that tonight it will be easier to call out and kind of learn new ways on how to address anti-Semitism. I'm now going to pass it to Ariel to share her experience.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ariel Mogilesco, and recently in my high school, the football team made it to their playoffs. And for playoffs, everyone does like funny or crazy hairstyles. And I happened one day to notice one that just didn't seem right. And this kid had his whole head was shaved except for a small circular patch on the back of his head. And as I was walking in the hallway passing by him, his friends surrounded him and started saying, "Jew, Jew, Jew," while pointing at him. Immediately, my stomach just turned, and I have a good relationship with the administrators in our school. So I went and I told them about the situation, and I was very thankful. They jumped right into action, first calling down the student, talking to his parents, talking to the football coach, and then the team. about how this was not a joke and how voluntarily choosing this hairstyle, why this was not okay. Come weeks later, I was at a friend's house when the boy and his friends all came up and surrounded me and continuously called me a snitch. So I'm here tonight partly to talk about how there should be a way to report and combat anti-Semitism without being afraid of the victimization that comes along with it. And now I'm proud to turn over the Zoom room to you, Rachel. Thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Tribe Talk, Robin, Jude, and Michelle. Thank you also, Carly, Haley, and Ariel for being part of this evening and also sharing your personal experiences in terms of encounters with anti-Semitism. And of course, we know that this is not something anyone wants to address in terms of having to confront it. And it feels as if we should be at a moment in time, since it's the 21st century, where we should be beyond anti-Semitism, but we are not. And part of the conversation this evening is for us to think as a community in terms of how best to make Jew hatred socially unacceptable in the 21st century. Before I dive into the PowerPoint presentation, I have some images to show you. We're going to talk about the ways in which Jew hatred manifests today. I wanted to make sure that we all are using and have an understanding of the terminology that will be used. If you notice, I'm using the term Jew hatred. I prefer to use that term rather than the term anti-Semitism. And I'll give you the two reasons why. Firstly, the term anti-Semitism was coined by Wilhelm Marr in 1879, himself an anti-Semite. So why do I want to use a term that was created by someone who hates Jews? He created the term antisemitumus in order to make it politically acceptable, correct, in Germany, to replace the term Judenhass, Jew hatred. Jew hatred sounded too crass. Well, Jew hatred is crass, so we ought to be able to call it what it is. The other reason I don't want to use the term anti-Semitism is because from research that we've conducted, we know that the younger you are, the less likely you are to even understand what the term anti-Semitism means. We interviewed 10,500 North Americans between the ages of 13 to 35 years of age, demographically, ethnically, religiously representative. And when we asked 13 to 35-year-olds, what is anti-Semitism? The majority responded, IDK. I don't know. We then heard from folks who said, well, what's a Semite? Fair question. It's not a term you hear so often. We also heard from individuals, I'm anti-racist, I'm anti-homophobic, I'm anti-Islamophobic, so I must be an anti-Semite. Well, ideally, you're an anti-Semite, but even the construct of the word is confusing to many individuals. So I prefer to use the term Jew hatred, where it is very clear. Some prefer hatred of Jews, but this way people understand exactly what we're speaking about. So that's the reason that term is going to be utilized, but I'll interchange every now and again here around anti-Semitism and Jew hatred. But if you're speaking to folks who don't know what anti-Semitism is, err on the side of Jew hatred in terms of terminology. Now we're living in a world in which, and our teens can tell us, that it's not a question anymore of, will I encounter anti-Semitism, but rather, when will I encounter anti-Semitism? And it either is going to happen in the halls of your school, it's going to happen on the soccer fields or the basketball courts. It's going to happen around your locker. It's going to happen in professional circles. And it definitely is going to happen on this device, on social media platforms. There is no getting around it anymore. So we have to begin to understand the ways in which Jew hatred manifests, from where it is coming, because we have to be unequivocal in denouncing it when it exists, and understand that there are various permutations, and they have particular advocates, particular individuals who proliferate these particular messages, and yet they all end at the exact same point, which is a focus on hating Jews. Now, in some cases, And this is not an entire history of how anti-Semitism originated and has emerged and transformed over time. But in some cases, you will hear people talk about hatred towards Judaism, the religion, the adherents of the religion, hatred towards Jews, the people, and hatred towards the Jewish state, the state of Israel. And in each of these cases, they are talking about a clear focus on othering, on delegitimizing, on dehumanizing in order to push down and to marginalize. That is the attempt. So let's unpack a little bit, and I'm going to share my screen right now, the ways in which we see Jew hatred exist today. Everyone see the screen? Great. So I'm going to talk briefly about the various expressions of anti-Semitism. And this is not in a particular order, so don't read into it. This is just in terms of the presentation. We know that Jew hatred exists from the political hard right. As Americans, and I'm not sure if everyone here is from America, but for those of you who are American, which I assume is the majority of folks on this Zoom, we actually have some understanding and familiarity with the way in which white supremacy has expressed itself in the American historical experience. We also understand the influence of that white supremacy positions melded with a form of Christian nationalism. When we see expressions of Jew hatred coming from the political hard right, Jews are often perceived as not white. They are the other, which is what we understand from the Jewish historical experiences similar in the European context, meaning Jews in a European context in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries were labeled Orientals. They were labeled Semites. And that was in order to be able to clearly connote that they were not, quote unquote, pure European. This is a carryover from that particular experience. In certain forms of Christian theology, there is still a desire to supersede, replace, supplant the covenant between Jews and God and suggest that this new covenantal relationship in a Christian theological context means that Jews and Judaism no longer ought to be understood in terms of a special covenantal relationship. We also know this plays into that Christian nationalism and the perception of Jews being the ones culpable for the murder of Jesus, even though that is historically inaccurate. These are the general contours of how we see anti-Semitism, Jew hatred emerge on the hard right. You often will see, like we did in Charlottesville in 2017, the rebel flag from the Confederacy is next to a swastika. You will also see, if you recall, from the events of January 6th, when we had the insurrection at our Capitol, individuals wearing shirts that stood for 6 million weren't enough. These are members of the Proud Boys. During the period of COVID, we have seen a proliferation of memes, cartoons, images that revert to traditional old stereotypes of anti-Semitic portrayals of Jews with the long nose, looking nefarious, sharp teeth, seeking to do harm. And most recently, we saw over the Los Angeles freeway just a month ago, Kanye is right, surrounded by individuals who identified as neo-Nazis and skinheads, and also using Christian text and order from the New Testament to even enhance and amplify their particular position. Now, as we transition to think about what's happening on the hard right, and I mention this because of why white supremacists are picking up what Kanye or Ye began to say also in the months of December, November, in which he talked about Zionists and used Zionists as a lazy code for Jews. And I hope that you all keep this in your mind as we continue to engage in our program this evening, because that is a move that has been done since the period of the Russian Empire and the former Soviet Union, in which Jews and Zionists became synonymous with one another, and it became a more politically correct way to then tarnish Jews and create anti-Semitism around this particular euphemism. And we see this play out particularly on the political hard left. Now, on the political hard left, it's the opposite of what we saw on the political hard right in terms of Jews are actually perceived as white. And because Jews are perceived as white, they must be privileged. And if they are privileged, they are often deemed to be the oppressor, the colonialist, the imperialist. What this means very often is that Jews are asked to check their particular identity in order to be accepted into other communities, whether it is communities related to gender and sexuality, whether it is communities related to LGBTQ plus issues, whether it is communities related to climate change, things that have nothing to do with Judaism and Zionism. And yet, in order to fully participate in those different identity communities, there is a sort of requirement that you have to push away that particular aspect of your identity in order to be fully accepted. This is often referred to as erasive anti-Semitism. And we've seen this in a variety of social movements, particularly beginning on college campuses, but not only on college campuses. So let's look at a few examples of how this has taken place. Here we have an image. This is an image that came about in June of 2020, and it was created as a response to the events that happened to the murder of George Floyd. Now, what you see in this image is an American policeman with the knee on the neck of George Floyd, with his arm around an Israeli policeman whose knee is on the neck of a Palestinian. And this then not only was picked up by organizations like Black Lives Matter, but also the Iranian government and pushed throughout social media in order to amplify tensions between Jews and Blacks. Similarly, we see art, cartoons, imagery put forth by the social movement Black Lives Matter. Here you have a policeman's knee labeled a leg, white supremacy, and his leg is on the necks of Native Americans, Palestinians, and Blacks, suggesting once again that it is white supremacists who ultimately, at the end of the day, are pushing down all indigenous communities. And if you look at the copy on the right, it says it is all rooted in the settler colonialism mentality and in the deeply systematized belief of the supremacy of one race over another. This is the kind of imagery you will often see coming from the hard left in order to express their positions around Jew hatred. But it doesn't only need to be imagery that appears on social media. At Berkeley Law School, for example, over the summer, a group of Berkeley law students spanning a variety of student organizations, all affiliated with the law school, decided that it was not going to be acceptable for the law school student groups to invite any speaker who held a Zionist or a pro-Israel perspective. And this got a lot of attention in the past year, in the past 6 months, I would say. And there's a debate around the role of Zionism and the conversations about Zionism, issues of free speech and academic freedom at the law school. And it took on a whole life of its own with the dean of the law school and a variety of outside organizations trying to raise awareness about why it is so problematic to suggest that only a particular type of speaker, a Zionist speaker, doesn't have the right to speak at a place like Berkeley. So that's another example in a way in which we see anti-Semitism exist. I want to talk about two more. And I want to just name that I know it's not comfortable to talk about all of these forms of anti-Semitism, particularly for many of us who care about so many of these issues that we know intersect and can be challenging in terms of how anti-Semitism emerges or how Jew hatred or anti-Zionist positions emerge in these conversations. And also it can be uncomfortable for folks because when we talk about Jew hatred coming from other vulnerable minority communities, we often feel maybe a feeling of discomfort because of the racial conversation and the racial lens that has been imposed by the American challenges unrelated to much of this, and yet it becomes the primary lens that refracts all of these issues. So I want to name that for some of those, for those of you who may feel some discomfort. And I also want to say we got to lean into that conversation so that we can be swivel-headed and have the ability to understand the ways in which Jew hatred exists, irrespective of the communities from which it comes, and have the ability to educate about it, ameliorate, and also confront it. So let's talk about the anti-Semitism that we've seen most recently from within the Black and African American communities. Now, it's not a new challenge. I know that for many, particularly when we think about American Jewish history, we like to think about the positive relationships between Jews and Blacks, particularly during the Civil Rights Movement. We conjure up the images of Martin Luther King Jr. and Joshua Heschel walking in Selma, holding hands, praying with their feet, in order to confront the historical legacy of white supremacy and to try in order to protect all minority communities. And that is an important part of the conversation, but it is not the only side of the conversation. Issues around expressions of anti-Semitism coming from within the Black and African American communities in America is not new. Ever since the period of the 1950s and 1960s, with the influence of Black nationalists and liberationist movements, we have seen the ways in which Jew hatred creeps into the ideological orientation. Jews are perceived as powerful, Blacks are perceived as powerless. For those of you who are familiar with the incredible author, James Baldwin, who has written some very valuable works, he also wrote some very problematic works, many of which related to Jews. In 1972, in one of James Baldwin's essays, he writes, "The powerless, by definition, can never be racist." That becomes a very important mantra that many Black and African American leaders will cling on to and hold on to throughout their proliferation of Jew hatred, whether it's with Louis Farrakhan, Stokely Carmichael, and many others, Jesse Jackson. These individuals assume that because of their skin color, they themselves can't be considered racist or anti-Semitic because of their own personal identities. The other challenge in terms of the way in which Jew hatred can emerge around the Black and African American conversation is also related to a longer conversation related to this concept of intersectionality, in which Blacks often will identify with the Arab political movements, particularly with the Palestinians, because they see themselves all as people of color. And as people of color, they are aligned in order to throw off the yoke of the white colonialist oppressor. And in that case, that becomes the Jew, that becomes Israel. And Zionism in that equation is perceived as imperialism. Here we see Louis Farrakhan displaying the book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. This is a book that it claims that Blacks were and Jews ultimately had a problematic relationship because Jews were primarily slaveholders in the American colonies. So again, it tells you this is an idea retroactively being put into this conversation for the purpose of trying to hold Jews accountable for the ills of society. We also know Whoopi Goldberg and her recent remarks, not just, 4 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, but also last year, in which Whoopi Goldberg mistakenly suggests that the Holocaust wasn't about race. Now, what's challenging here is that we know that Jews are not just a race. Jews are an ethno-religious community. That means we are a people, we are a tribe, and we are a religious community. That's a very difficult concept for many Americans to understand, not because there are not other ethno-religious communities. Islam would be an ethno-religious community as well, but because in the American framework of Christian identity, that ethno piece is foreign to the conversation. Whoopi Goldberg, why she made this mistake is that she sees Jews only as white in this case, and as white, she ultimately doesn't understand that Jews in the European context were not deemed to be white. They were Semites. That's how they were categorized. They were the other. And that the purpose of the Holocaust was ultimately about racializing the concept of Jews in order to get rid of them. So because they were not the pure Aryans who were desired to be the ones to lead the nation. Now let's talk about one other form of anti-Semitism, and this is within radical Islamism. Within radical Islamism, and I want to be very clear, I'm not talking about all of Islam. Not all Muslims hate Jews. That is not what I am saying. But there are some individuals who practice radical forms of Islamism who have hijacked and manipulated the religion and have actually connected it deeply, not only in terms of their theology, but in terms of their nationalism for a clear political agenda. There is a concept within Islam called Dar al-Islam, the realm of peace, and Dar al-Harb, the realm of war. This concept suggests that anywhere in which Islam controlled territory, think about the Muslim conquest of Spain, for example, then it is incumbent upon Muslims today to reinstate the caliphate in order to continue to control that territory that used to be under Muslim rule. And you must engage in a holy war, jihad, in order to do that work. That's the realm of war. In this framework, Jews and Israel are a real problem because of the location of the land of Israel and the state of Israel, in which Israel is deemed to be a realm of war, and it is incumbent upon those who subscribe to this position to engage in holy war against Jews in order to remove that Jewish state. There's, of course, also the ways in which the radical Muslims, radical Islamists, not only practice this in terms of Hamas and Hezbollah, but also in terms of those individuals who influence the discourse about Israel and who refuse to normalize relations with Israel because de facto it does exist. And as a result, they feel compelled to continue to pursue virulent forms of Jew hatred in order to be able to ultimately suppress the Jewish people. And here you see images that you have seen previously. These are terrorists, Hamas affiliates, and protests that take place in the Arab world, equating Nazism with the Star of David. So those are just some basic frameworks that I want to provide you all with in terms of understanding the various ways in which Jew hatred exists. I want to say just two more things, and then I'm happy to turn it over to our teens and to Rob and Jude. Some of what we see happening in our society today, we can clearly identify and label, and we understand that it is clearly Jew hatred. Other times, we don't have as much confidence to understand if it is Jew hatred. It also becomes complicated when we see individuals, some of whom may have be from a vulnerable community, some may have a darker pigmentation of their skin, and when they promote forms of Jew hatred, and then it gets amplified and picked up by hardcore white supremacists, it becomes quite complicated to understand how do you disentangle all of these different manifestations. And you do have to look at it on a case-by-case basis if you're trying to truly understand the different permutations. And at the same time, understand that you have to look at, is this promoting a form of hatred? Is this calling for demonization? Is this looking to dehumanize? Does it try to other and ultimately push down and suppress a particular community? And then whether or not it comes from any of these manifestations, if that is what it is doing, you then clearly can label it as a form of Jew hatred. Now, the question then becomes, what do you do with it? And it really depends on the particular situation. You heard from some of the teens' experiences that they've had. But what I would say is that you really have three choices. One is to ignore it. One is to confront it. And one is to educate about it. Call in or call out. And depending upon the particular circumstances, those are decisions you will have to make. I am not a proponent of ever ignoring it. Others may give you a situation in which that might be the right case. I can't think of one in which that actually leads to anything meaningful. I actually believe very strongly that the majority of individuals are don't knows. They truly don't know. And so therefore, we have an obligation to try to sensitize them in order to help them become knows so that they have the ability to become upstanders, and for you all to help them learn that being a bystander is no longer an option. For those who are engaging in this type of activity, meaning proliferating Jew hatred, it doesn't mean that you can change their heart and mind if they truly hate, and yet you have to find a way to marginalize them, to minimize them, where appropriate, ensure that there are consequences for their actions, and confront it. And yes, to Carly and Haley and Ariel, that does not mean, it's easy, and it doesn't mean that you yourself won't also at times be caught in the crosshairs. And so that's why it's extremely important that you talk to your parents, you talk to your teachers, your educators, you talk to community members, coaches that you feel connected to in order for them to be able to help support and navigate some of the very challenging situations that you may encounter. So I just want to leave it at that, and I'll hand it back to you, Robin.
Rachel, thank you so much. There's so much there to think about. We really appreciate it. At this point, we're going to take questions. So you can put up your virtual hand, you can wave your actual hand, you can put a question in the chat, you could text Jude and I. Anyway, we will get to the questions. And I want to give Ariel the first opportunity to ask a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, kind of related to my earlier example about like the football hairstyle, about how moving forward, if something, and I guess inevitably when something occurs, of like how you can stand up and kind of take a stance against that act of hate without feeling victimized for doing so.
I'm not going to have a great answer, I think, for you, Ariel. I think that you have to know that you're in the right. And you're in the right. And so therefore, even if individuals target you, it doesn't mean that you aren't actually displaying moral courage. And your example of moral courage will stand out and help others exemplify that moral courage as well. I do think there are opportunities in your particular situation to also ask the administration for a day of learning, a teach-in. It may not even be a full day, it could be half a day, and it doesn't only have to be about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism can be one of the conversations, but it needs to be part of the conversation. And that then also helps sensitize individuals so that they then have greater understanding of why it is not funny, why it is a problem. But I think that the best advice I've ever received from anyone was from one of my favorite professors who told me, all you need is a gang. You need a couple of people, Ariel, who feel the way you feel that you can turn to at any point, and the rest you don't really need. And I know that's really hard. I really do know that's hard, but I'm telling you now, you actually don't need them if they hate you. Or if they're that ignorant and they don't want to learn, you don't need to surround yourself with them.
Thank you.
Carly or Haley?
I can ask my question. So I think like this is more for like modern, specifically in relation to Kanye West. Is there a way to like separate the art from the artist? Because I know a lot of my friends who are Jewish, they're like, I want to listen to his music, but how can I support him when he's like saying all of this like awful things about Jewish people? So I was just wondering.
It's a great question, Haley, and it's actually not a new question. It might be new with respect to Kanye, but it's not new in terms of how have Jews navigated engaging with countries, cultural influencers, artists, composers, companies, Volkswagen, for example, when there is a historical legacy of those entities holding anti-Semitic positions. Now, it's actually a very personal choice at the end of the day. You have to decide, do you want to actually listen to the music of Wagner, a composer, a German composer, knowing full well his association with Nazism? Do you read the literature of Roald Dahl, the books like James and the Giant Peach, knowing full well that he did not like Jews, and many of the ugliest characters in his books are negative portrayals of Jews? Now, those are questions you have to ask yourself. So I'm not going to sit here and say, you should listen to Kanye, or how dare you listen to Kanye? That's not what I would say. But what I would say is it's important to remember that you can appreciate art, you can appreciate countries, you can appreciate brands, even knowing that they hold and have anti-Semitic positions. Now, it's a question of whether you actually provide funding to those places. It's a question of whether or not you yourself can hold that complexity, or your friends can hold that complexity. But it is a question that's not new to this conversation in any shape or form. And it's a personal issue, but it's one that I think also allows both an opportunity to educate and say, you know, if you're going to listen to it, just know who he is, know exactly what he believes on this particular subject, and understand that that's who you're listening to. But everyone has to make their own choice around that.
Thank you.
Carly.
Yeah, my question was, how do you approach a situation where, let's say, close friends of yours or people who you talk to on a regular basis kind of make comments that they think are jokes, but to you really are not jokes at all, and actually like you kind of take it to heart and kind of realize that you don't really feel safe around these people, but you don't really know how to tell them that?
It's a great question, Carly. So, depending upon, again, the context and the way in which these conversations are taking place, first, I would say, if it's taking place in person and you actually have a real relationship with someone and you're telling me you don't feel physically safe, then you need to reconsider that friendship. If you're telling me that it's about an intellectual safety, right, you don't like what they're saying, then I think you have the ability to be able to say to a person who you think is an acquaintance or a friend, and you can do something in the way you say it to them by asking a question. You don't have to be confrontational, but you can say, do you really know what you're saying right now when you use that word? Or when you paint Jews in a particular way, do you really understand how that makes me feel? You can even say, I'm Jewish, right? Because if you know I'm Jewish, would it make you pause before you say something that lacks such knowledge and is completely ignorant? And you can say that. Now, you may not want to say that, but you can. And sometimes by hitting the pause button and asking a question, and if you want, you can even do it more nicely, right? You can say, what you're saying right now, it actually really bothers me. And I'd be interested in telling you why it bothers me. Would you be open to having that conversation? You guys can do that. There's not a single doubt in my mind that you can say that to someone. If you don't feel you can say that to someone, my gut tells me you probably shouldn't be hanging out with this individual because they're not probably someone who has your best interests at heart. If this is something that's taking place on social media, it is not worth getting involved in the conversation on social media because it is not a conversation. The purpose of social media is in order for enraging. That is how the algorithms are built. What enrages, engages. And so you can't have a meaningful exchange of ideas on social. And if it is someone you know, I would suggest you send them a note, DM them, or put it in their comments and say, is there a chance you and I could have a real conversation at school tomorrow? Because you're not going to change someone's mind online, and it's actually only going to feed the trolls, and it's not going to be good for anyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Ariel, did you have another question?
I do. I was gonna ask, if you were in the future, obviously we're going off to school next year, if your teacher were to say something that you view as like anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, how you would go about handling that situation?
So again, it depends on the particular context, Ariel. I'm a big believer in having conversations. So you could easily go to the professor or the teacher and say, there was something you mentioned in class today. I'd love to talk to you about it because it made me feel uncomfortable. And I don't think I was the only student who felt uncomfortable. And I'd like to tell you why. And then have that conversation and then see how the individual responds. I do understand that there can be a power dynamic and that it can feel challenging to have that conversation, but you should feel that you have the ability to do that when an educator or a teacher, a professor, whomever it is, says something that gives you pause. Now, this conversation is not about Israel necessarily. I do just want to say, if it's a critique of Israeli policy and it's within a larger context, that doesn't mean it's anti-Semitic. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily positive towards Israel, but it doesn't mean it's anti-Semitic. If the teacher or individual is saying Israel has no right to exist, or there should not be a Jewish state, that's anti-Semitic. So you have to be able to contextualize what the individual is saying and how it's being said.
Thank you.
Rachel, if I could follow up on that, we got a question texted that is, can you talk about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and how you draw the line between valid criticism of Israel versus unfair demonization of Israel? It seems like this is a very good point to answer that one.
Sure. So there is a working definition. It's called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. It is the working definition of anti-Semitism. It is not legally binding. This is a definition that has been accepted by many of the world's nation states. It's also been accepted by many universities. It's also been accepted by even many companies. And the working definition, and if you go to the IHRA website, you will find that working definition. And within that working definition, which is also the definition accepted by the United States State Department, what you will find is that there are very specific examples within the working definition that provide contemporary examples around Israel. Now, just so you understand, this working definition, and I have it right in front of me, so I'm just going to read it to you, says, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions, and religious facilities. And then it goes through those various examples in terms of drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, or using the symbols and images associated with classical anti-Semitism to characterize Israel or Israelis. So there are very specific examples within the working definition that can be very useful in order to help situate what is beyond acceptable criticism and actually falls into the category of Jew hatred.
Rachel, I have a couple of questions that have come in as well. One in particular. What is a good way to react to the age-old argument that Jews killed Jesus? And hold on one second, I had another one that was coming in.
Sure.
Feel free to put the questions in the chat. Again, I've gotten a few questions from folks. Yes, they're specifically coming to us and not to the group. So that is not an error, that is intentional. So we keep everybody focused on the program and not chatting in between each other, although we do love that as well. But I will say this, what do you think, why do you think anti-Semitism is not being included in conversations about DEI, and how could it be brought into the conversation on campuses? Just giving you one more. You can respond back as well. Does the increase of Jew hate contribute to teenage views and feelings about Israel?
Okay, let's do Jews as Christ killers first. First of all, if you go to the ADL website, if you go to the American Jewish Committee website, you can easily see a brief history of why that is patently false. Jews did not kill Jesus. What's important also just to know historically is that the Catholic Church doesn't actually address this fallacy until 1965 with Nostra Aetate and the Second Vatican Council. So I just want you to understand that for a minute. That idea that Jews killed Christ wasn't actually denounced by the Catholic Church until 1965, post-Holocaust. So much damage has been done under this idea that Jews should be held responsible for the death of Jesus. And you have to understand that the Catholic Church, since this period, since the Second Vatican Council, in many ways has tried to address the challenges between Jewish, Christian, Jewish, Catholic relations. And it has gone way beyond, not just in terms of top-down relationships between the Vatican and the Jewish religious leadership, but in terms of a variety of interfaith initiatives as well. So that is important to understand, and know that that's also, as an accusation, never going to go away. I grew up in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. I heard it all the time. There was a working assumption that I was responsible and that because my family didn't accept Jesus, we therefore had to take responsibility for this murder. So just know that this is a blood libel that will continue to emerge and transform and will never actually dissipate. The second question in terms of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and diversity, equity, and inclusion officers are very important parts of companies and universities and even some secondary schools now. And in these schools, particularly, there is a lot, also in the workplace, a lot of emphasis being placed on ensuring that real sensitivity training takes place around understanding various communities. Now, that's very important. That being said, very often talking about Jews, Judaism, and Israel, and understanding the ways in which anti-Semitism manifests in those various categories has not been part of the DEI conversation. There have been some shifts. The Hillel International, through the Campus Climate Initiative, as well as the Academic Engagement Network, which works specifically with faculty, has been working for quite a while now on trying to provide sensitivity training to DEI officers and university administrators, where anti-Semitism is part of the sensitivity training. There are also initiatives by organizations like SHMA and the ADL and other organizations that are working specifically with companies in order to also provide DEI training to those institutions. And all of that is necessary, and it is not sufficient, and it is important for all of you, whichever institutions you are associated with, if you are required to go to DEI training, to insist that that training integrate and include issues around anti-Semitism as well. And the reason this often isn't done is because, one, Jews are perceived to be part of the white majority and are not understood as a vulnerable minority. And secondly, they do not understand anti-Semitism and only think of it in terms of being focused on a religious hate and not actually in these other permutations. So it's really necessary for you all to try to insist on integrating that kind of sensitivity training. And that's so that the don't knows become sensitized and have greater capability of identifying, labeling, and addressing Jew hatred when they encounter it as well. The third question, if I remember it correctly, Jude, was focused on, does anti-Semitism have the ability or capacity to influence some distancing from younger Jewish teens from Israel? Is that accurate? What we are seeing in some recent surveys done by Hillel International, done by the Jim Joseph Foundation, is that there is a shift occurring among Jewish students on campus not feeling comfortable disclosing their Jewish identity. They hide it. Now, if you are a Jew who is traditionally observant and wears traditional cultural outward garb, and so you are outwardly identified as a Jew, you can't hide it. If you are a Jew who is not traditionally observant in that way with your outward garb, you can at times hide it. And we are hearing from Jewish students, they are taking off their kippah, they are hiding their Magen David, they are not willing to publicly disclose that they are Jewish. There is a challenge in terms of wanting to feel part of the larger collective and be part of the universal concerns that many of us care about. And there's pressure to check that Jewishness, that Zionist identity at the door in order to be fully accepted. That is very real. It's not a new problem, but it is definitely a challenge that young students are experiencing on college campuses. There are also outlets for students so that they don't have to feel that way. And what I would say to those who are on this call, who are going on college campus or are already on college campus, if you want to be part of a particular community or group that asks you to check your identity at the door, you can be certain that that organization is not interested in the causes that they actually are talking about and rather have ulterior motives. And my suggestion to you is to start your own club that focuses on that particular issue and actually do the work and expose the hypocrisy and the absurdity and the anti-Semitic rhetoric and identity of those individuals who have a different agenda. Don't play by their rules. Create your own group. You don't need to be part of something that doesn't want to fully accept you. And I think that's really important for you all to remember.
On that note, Rachel, I have a question here. My students reported an incident where their public school teacher announced that the school would be closed on Rosh Hashanah and that we should thank the Jews for having a day off. This made the students feel very uncomfortable. What would the best response be to give them in that situation?
They were uncomfortable because the teacher
I guess
said-
announced. The question is, the teacher and somebody made a big announcement that we should thank the Jews.
Oh, we should
that we
thank-
have a gay day off.
Well, I would say you're welcome. You know, that's what I would say. Do we thank Black people because we have Martin Luther King Day off? No. When something is that absurd and it feels uncomfortable in your gut, call it out. It's ridiculous. It's just absurd. I mean, don't take it seriously, because sometimes the best way to confront this stuff is with rhetoric and to show the absurdity and the ignorance of the person. What is it? You know, the higher you climb, the more ass the monkey shows. Keep climbing, because it's pretty ridiculous. Sorry, Jude, if that's not okay.
Along those lines, we have a few more questions. How can I talk about my onward internship in Israel this summer and maintain my liberal identity in the eyes of my far left peers?
Here's the challenge when it comes to the conversation about Israel right now. And again, I know this is not a discourse about Israel, but what's important to note is that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. As a democracy, it has elected a government that actually may not feel the same about a lot of the democratic liberal values that many of us feel. And we have to see how this country is going to create policy and what those policies will be. Just because a government that is elected holds positions with which you don't agree doesn't mean that government in that country does not have a right to exist. It doesn't mean that you abandon that government and that country and those people because of who is in power, but rather you stay all the more so deeply committed to it and connected to it in order to continue to work for the values that you care about and that you feel represent your Jewish identity. That is what it's about. If you have friends who say, how could you be so proud of being affiliated or having an internship in a country that supports all of these anti-democratic positions? Then you say, I don't work for the government. I'm not a spokesperson for the government. I worked for specific organizations that had the following mission, and I believe in that mission. I believe in the work we did with the following sectors of Israeli society. And I am committed as a Jew to see that Israel remains a strong Jewish and democratic state. And if someone says, I think that you're supporting a fascist entity, they're ignorant. They don't understand about what they speak. And you need to be able to say to them, listen, every nation state aspires to be a particular type of sovereignty. And not every nation state lives up to all of its aspirations. And it is not my responsibility to judge that nation state, but rather to continue to be connected to it and to work towards its aspirations as much as I possibly can. So that's how you talk about it. You don't walk away from it. When this country in America does things you're not proud of, do you go and burn your American flag and get rid of your passport? I doubt it. So you got to find a way to stay involved and connected even when you do not agree with the actual governmental policies. And all the more so, that should encourage you to get more involved, more connected, and be more deeply engaged.
Why has Jew hatred increased so much in the US, or is it just that it's more acceptable to manifest it now? Was it really there all along? And is it just that it was there all along, or is it that it's just okay to manifest it now?
So I'm pretty sure that this is a trick question, but I'm gonna answer it in the following way.
I'm reading them the way I get them.
I hear you. First of all, this country does have a history of anti-Semitism. We can't pretend it doesn't. It is not the same history as Europe, and that's very important to distinguish. But it doesn't mean that this country didn't have historical moments in which Jews were identified as pariahs, that Jews were not accepted, whether it was in professional circles, whether it was in university administration, universities for admissions. There are a variety of ways in which Jews have not been part of this American experience. And America has been exceptional for Jewish history. And it's that exceptionalism that actually led many in the Jewish community to actually feel as if anti-Semitism was not a problem in this country. And it wasn't compared to what was happening throughout the Arab world. It wasn't compared to what was happening throughout Europe. We also, as American Jews, for many, didn't recognize or understand what was happening coming from the political hard left. Now, Jews who came from the former Soviet Union and Jews who came from communist countries actually understand much more clearly than many American Jews do what's happening on the hard political left. And that's been a challenge for the American Jewish community, all the more so because American Jews tend to be majority voting for Democrats. And so all the more so that has been challenging. We have much more ability to identify the Jew hatred that's coming from the political hard right because we understand it and the remnants of it that resonate from the European experience. The other piece here is that the American Jewish community, I would argue, has been reluctant to actually state that we are in a time of an emergency, that the levels of Jew hatred that we are now encountering are at levels that we have not seen since the period of the 1920s, the 1930s. And I'm not suggesting America is on the brink of what Jews were facing during the Holocaust, but what I am saying is that our Jewish communal leaders have actually been, for the most part, apoplectic and paralyzed because they haven't been willing to actually go on the offensive to confront much of this Jew hatred. This Jew hatred does not go away if we just sit here and think that if we teach enough people that all of a sudden Jew hatred will be abolished. Jew hatred will always exist. It will persist. It will be here for my children, for their children, and for their children. So therefore, we have to find a way to make it socially unacceptable, the way it is socially unacceptable to talk about other minority communities. You know that you don't say certain words. You know that you don't label people certain ways, because if you do, there is a price that you will pay personally and professionally. We have to make it clear that there is a price to pay when you engage in Jew hatred, both personally and professionally. I'm not talking about canceling people. I'm talking about clear consequences and ramifications for engaging with hate and targeting Jews and seeking our demise. It cannot be allowed to continue. And until our community is willing to do the hard things and confront it in a variety of realms, governmentally, policy, litigation, and education, it will not at all be ameliorated or marginalized.
I know we're over the 9 o'clock hour here, but I've got some fantastic questions. So stick with us, folks. And if you do have to go, please know that we will be sharing the recordings and you can catch us on the back end. But a couple of other quick questions, Rachel. One is, you alluded to this, but just maybe you can just deeper dive. Do you have any suggestions how the Jewish community can hold itself more accountable to call out expressions of anti-Semitism when they occur? As you said, for various reasons, passes are given to groups. What can we as a Jewish community do about this to do better?
Look, first of all, you have to build bridges between communities. That's very important. And I don't want to suggest that it's not, but you can't build those bridges between communities in a time of crisis. You have to build bridges between communities when there isn't a crisis. And that means actually getting into a real relationship and doing so in order to understand the other and help them understand who you are. And in order to understand so that you come to the table fully as yourself. And ideally that happens at a very young age. that happens regularly as you continue to have a long life, so that it's happening at multiple stages between different types of individuals. And so that you can actually say, now I have an understanding from where you come. It doesn't mean that you're going to agree with everything. It doesn't mean that you're going to be politically aligned about everything, but you will have a better sense of who the individual is. We know from the work of psychologists that when you know someone, you are much less likely to denigrate them. You are much less likely to hate them. You are more likely to stand up for them because you'll say, wait a minute, I have a friend who's Jewish. I have a friend who's gay. I have a friend who looks differently, speaks differently, comes from a different place, and that's not who they are. So you have to do that. That's really important. The Jewish community has not done that for a very long time. We've rested on our laurels. And we haven't done that proactively with a variety of communities. Now we're in a time of crisis, and we're trying to figure out how do we do that. We also, at the same time, while we're building those bridges, younger, earlier, deeper, and regularly, have to find a way to say, let me tell you, the positions you hold ultimately harm the Jewish people. Jewish lives are at stake when you use language like that. Jewish people are targeted when you say things in the following way. And there's plenty of proof points now to demonstrate it. So that also has to be done. And if your Jewish communal leaders aren't doing this, these are not elected officials. They are appointed. Feel free to call them out. Go to their boards. Go to their donors. Put pressure on them. Because what is their job if not to do this work? So anyone can do that. It doesn't take a special person to do that. It takes someone who says, this cannot be the world that my children inherit. And I think all of us want a better world for our children. And so therefore, we have a responsibility to make that happen.
I have two more, and then I promise we'll wrap up. One, I think, is very interesting new book that's now out that one of our panelists put in the chat. Familiar with the recent book by David Bernstein called Woke Antisemitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. How a progressive ideology harms Jews. What do you think of this thesis, or his thesis?
David Bernstein did write an important book. It's very worthwhile to read. David Bernstein is drawing attention to the ways in which what we would call progressive ideology, what is often referred to also as wokeism, how it ultimately seeks to engage in this erasive anti-Semitism. And so if you haven't read it, it's worth reading, again, particularly because for many American Jews, we do not understand the anti-Semitism coming from the left of center political framework, because it is not the experience here in America, and it is not the same as what happened in terms of fascism and Nazism. So we have to understand it. And this is important, particularly because in many educational institutions, universities, and even younger, this is an ideology that ultimately informs much of the discourse, the conversations, and young people will engage with it. They will encounter it in this particular framework. And so Bernstein's book becomes very valuable in that context.
Thank you. We have one last question, and then we will wrap up. So thanks so much, Rachel, for sticking with us here. So the question I have is, what can we do to help bring this education to our own respective communities, like our kids' schools, synagogues, etc.? And how can this type of education provided by Tribe Talk today extend its reach into the community?
Well, I think that's an answer for Tribe Talk, Jude and Robin. I don't think that's an answer for Rachel. Rachel is always happy to help, but Tribe Talk is definitely a central address.
Sure enough. All right, then. Stay tuned. Thank you for that, Rachel. So without further ado, we will come to the close of our evening. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you to Haley, Ariel, Carly. We've learned a lot tonight. Thank you for sticking with us. And thank you for educating us. Please watch out for an email and a brief survey. I promise that the survey will only take a few minutes. We really, really want to hear from you. And the recording for tonight's evening program will be on our website very, very soon. And under the webinar section at tribetalk.org. If you've not checked us out, please do. We've got great content for everyone. But really, thank you for attending tonight. Please follow us if you're not on Instagram, on Facebook, and of course, join our tribe. We've got a lot of wonderful upcoming programs for you, and we're excited that you're here tonight. And we really want to wish you all a very good night and a happy and a healthy new year.